So right off the top, we have this for you. A former Reagan advisor, he was in the room when Reagan tax cuts were negotiated, says that the success of those Syrian airstrikes creates a sort of chance now for bipartisan tax reform. So come on in, David Smick, economist and former senior Hill staffer. David, you've got to connect these dots for us.
All right. So, okay, for the first time, Trump is being praised by Democrats for his Syria bombings. I say that I'm all for Plan A, which is the original plan by House Republicans to get health care reform through and then to get tax reform through on the second budget reconciliation. But it's a little like threading two needles. You've got to thread the needle on health care reform, both the House and Senate, and then do the same on tax reform. It's going to be doable but very tough. And I'm saying that Donald Trump loses nothing now that he's got a little bit of praise and he seems to be showing some flexibility to strike out with a bipartisan plan, a kind of a plan B. Now, he loses nothing because but he can't just say, as he said, I want to be bipartisan. You got to put a plan on the table. And so in
David,
today's Wall Street Journal, I offered a plan.
David, what would that plan look like in layman's terms? What are the key components there that can attract some Democrats without alienating too many Republicans?
Okay, well, I certainly would want middle-class tax relief and all the rest. But once you start talking about individual tax cuts, you cannot get an agreement with Democrats. So let's put the individual tax cuts on a separate reconciliation bill. Talk to the Democrats about four major planks. One is a corporate tax relief from 35 down to 20. Then I would go with a automatic expensing of all capital investments. The third thing would be some kind of a repatriation plan that would include the understanding that corporations repatriating would agree to buy a certain amount of low-interest rate infrastructure bonds. And then the third would be a massive infrastructure investment.
Right.
But I would include two sweeteners. I mean, I was involved in the 86 and 81 tax. Everything has a sweetener. You have to, for the Democrats, I would include, and I would, first of all, a voucher program that for disadvantaged families living in one part of the country where there are no jobs, to help them move to other parts of the country where they have job openings. And then I would also include a very modest, incremental hike in the minimum wage. Modest, very sensitive to a small business solvency.
And
but
President Trump actually
two things that
said on the campaign trail that he thought wages should be higher. Dave, I want to switch gears just a little bit because the Wall Street Journal says that the president, because of his meetings with these large businesses, they've actually had some influence on his recent policy shifts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I know what they're saying. It bothers me a little bit that we are gearing policy so much to the large corporate sector. If you look at what's happened since the financial crisis, you know, the large corporations took advantage of the 0% interest rate policy and bought back their stock. It's the small business and the startup sector that took it on the neck. And the same thing with the large banks. I heard your comments before, and you're exactly right. The large Wall Street banks, because they presented systemic risks, they got treated with kid glove treatment. And the small regional and the community banks took it in the neck. And they're the workhorses of the small business sector. And when you're a startup and then you want to expand, they're the ones you go to. And they have been in a terrible shape. So I think that, you know, Donald Trump ought to be thinking right now, large corporations and large banks are fine, but small is beautiful, and he ought to be concentrating on the entrepreneurial side a little bit more than he is.
One more for you, David. We had Congressman Peter Orozco. He's from the Tax Writing Committee on this program just yesterday, and I want you to take a listen to what he had to say about tax reform.
The notion that we can't move to tax reform, I think, is an overcharacterization. At some point, these plans will merge together. And it is supposed to be hard, difficult, and arduous to move something as big as tax reform. And the fact that we're talking about this process right now is proof of that difficulty. But here's what we need to know. We either move this in 2017, or I predict the opportunity will come and go.
David, you just laid out a very thoughtful, elaborate tax plan, but it seemed pretty big and hefty. Is there enough time to push something through like that, or do we need simplicity at this moment?
Yeah, well, I would say two things about the Congressman's comments. They're very interesting. If you look at the performance of the bond market, what the bond market is telling you, and now the stock markets are saying the same thing, this economy is not as strong as we thought. And so we've got to do something very quickly. But also, I think he's also making a good point. I was involved in the '86 tax reform, and people think it was easy back then. And it wasn't. I mean, for 2 years, we had tax reform. We had 5 different funerals for tax reform. We had all kinds of divisions within the Republican Party. Then we had a Democratic Party divisions, and it was written off as dead. But what happened is it was a bit of a fluke, but we got a somewhat radical plan out of the Reagan Treasury unexpectedly that kind of landed on everyone's desk, and it forced both sides, Republican and Democrats, to negotiate. That's kind of what I'm suggesting that Trump do. Throw a plan out there, and you know, plan beats no plan. So you have to get a plan out there for the negotiation. Do I think, look, once you get the plan out there, it doesn't matter how complicated it is. I mean, it's all complicated.
You've got something, a foundation, if you will. David, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.